4 True Shared Death Experiences. Number 1. William Peters was working as a volunteer in a hospice when he had a strange encounter with a dying man that changed his life. The man's name was Ron, and he was a former merchant marine who was afflicted with stomach cancer. Peters says he would spend up to 3 hours a day at Ron's bedside, talking to and reading adventure stories to him because few family or friends visited. When Peters plopped by Ron's bedside around lunch one day, the frail man was semi-conscious. Peters read passages from Jack London's Call of the Wild as the frail man struggled to hang on. What happened next, Peters says, was inexplicable. Peters says he felt a force jerk his spirit upward, out of his body. He floated above Ron's bedside, looking down at the dying man. Then he glanced next to him to discover Ron floating alongside him, looking at the same scene below. Peters says he then felt his spirit drop into his body again. The experience was over in a flash. Ron died soon afterward, but Peters' questions about that day lingered. He didn't know what to call that moment, but he eventually learned that it wasn't unique. Peters had a shared death experience. Number 2. One of the first shared death experiences to gain attention came during World War I from Karl Skala, a German poet. Skala was a soldier huddled in a foxhole with his best friend when an artillery shell exploded, killing his comrade. He felt his friend slump into his arms and die. He felt himself being drawn up with his friend, above their bodies, and then above the battlefield. Skala could look down and see himself holding his friend. Then he looked up and saw a bright light and felt himself going toward it with his friend. Then he stopped and returned to his body. He was uninjured except for a hearing loss that resulted from the artillery blast. Number 3. Penny Sartori, who was a nurse for 21 years, says she had a death vision that left her shaken. One night, she was preparing to give a bath to a dying patient who was hooked up to a ventilator and other life-prolonging equipment. She says she touched the man's bed, and everything around us stopped. She says her surroundings disappeared, and it was almost like I swapped places with him. She says she could suddenly understand everything the man was going through, including feeling his pain. He couldn't talk, but she says she could somehow hear him convey a heart-wrenching message. Leave me alone. Let me die in peace. Just let me die. Number 4. True story of a shared death experience. Annie Capp was born in the United States but eventually moved to England, where she worked for a telecommunications company. On the day after Christmas in 2004, she says her mother, Betty, suddenly fell ill at her home in Portland, Oregon. She was hospitalized, and over the next few days, all of her major organs began to shut down. Capp, however, says she didn't know her mother was dying. Yet, in a strange way, she says she did. Capp learned that her mother was ill, but says she couldn't get a flight during the holiday season, so all she could do was wait. She was in her London office with a client one day when she started to gag, struggling to breathe. She was mystified because she says she was in good health. She struggled for air for about 25 minutes, and with a growing sense of dread regarding her mother. I felt and heard this strange gurgling in my throat, she says. I started coughing and gagging, and I had this deep growing sadness. I quickly rescheduled my client, and once they had left, I ran as fast as I could to my house and called my mom's hospital room. That's when she learned that her mother was gasping for air, on the verge of death, Capp says. While Capp was on the phone, she says her mother died. She's convinced that she somehow shared her mother's death throes, but she kept denying it because she was an agnostic at the time who didn't believe in the afterlife. Now she says she does. It wasn't a blissful experience. She says of that day after Christmas, I was suffocating.